Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm Dr. Anthony Mazzella. On this channel, we go beyond labels and symptoms to explore the inner, often unconscious, emotional world behind narcissistic and related personality patterns. In these short clips from the full podcast, you'll get a clear, compassionate, psychodynamic insight into behavior. Here's a short clip from the podcast that highlights what this looks like in real life. Now imagine what it feels like when the old arrest, the old misdeed resurfaces through a failed background check. Suddenly the lie is alive again, visible, judged. The patient often experiences this as confirmation that the internal persecutor's message, that this makes you bad, or you must hide this, that's true. You see, this is the proof that you're bad. Psychodynamically, we might say, when shame is carried alone, it becomes a toxic secret. But when it's safely, I emphasize the word safely, when it's safely shared, it becomes a grief that can then be contained and held. And in the therapy room, this becomes the goal of psychodynamic treatment, to bring this split off, hidden part of the self to light. To deepen the work, I might say something like this. It sounds like when you failed the background check, or when you were denied the TSA pre-check. I mean, again, you could fill in the blank here. Whatever resonates with you. When you had the one-night stand. When you ran up the credit card again. It didn't just bring up fear. It stirred something much deeper and more painful. Or I could say something, when the past gets pulled into the present like this, it can feel like part of you that worked so hard to move on suddenly reappears. You see, in other words, everything good disappears. And then gently, I begin to wonder aloud. I'm curious what this touched inside of you. The goal with this question is to help them get in touch with, give voice to the split off part of the self. And it's here that I often hear people describe feeling seen as tainted, dirty, corrupt, bad, unlovable, or guilty, as though this one moment defines their entire being and self-worth. And sometimes, this is the moment that tears begin to come, not because of the failed background check, but again, what I typically hear is something about how they finally stop carrying the secret alone. And that's the beginning of integrating something that secrecy, by design, has always prevented. Contact with the real self brings with it a shared emotional life, and therefore a loosening of that internal persecutory voice that I mentioned earlier. The secret is no longer an isolated, exiled part of the psyche. It becomes something that can exist in his relationship with me rather than outside of it. The story gets told. That's the critical piece right here. The story gets told as I gently ask insightful questions and help him think a little beyond the failed background check, the one-night affair. Then, subsequently, by telling his fiancée the results of the failed test, he reintegrates those parts of himself. This can feel relieving because his self is now more whole, less managed, less curated, less false. Remember that word I used earlier, the false self. This is the beginning of the true self. It's an act of internal repair. In other words, the story gets told. It's not met with condemnation, which of course is the deepest fear. Remember, I said that earlier. And because the feared response does not occur, the internal meaning of the story begins to shift. If it had been met with disgust, punishment, or some kind of lecture. By the way, just as an aside, I often hear this with kids or parents whose kid lies to them and they find out there's a lecture rather than an attempt at accepting and understanding and trying to help them understand why it was necessary to lie. But in any matter, if the secret is met with punishment, a lecture, or some kind or any kind of moral judgment, the split off world now gets reinforced. The bad self is confirmed that that it's dangerous to be honest, in other words, or I am unlovable. and I am deserving of punishment. And that's the internal persecutor, right? That's the critical inner voice. And that's what gets strengthened when the secret is not accepted and contained. The psyche would learn once again that this part must remain hidden to survive. In other words, I should have never been honest. So here you have to be very careful that if someone comes to you with more honesty, that has to be contained and held, not a lecture and not a punishment. But that's not what happens in here. He learns, maybe I am not so bad. Maybe I can be known and still loved. And by the way, subsequently, this is what happens when he spoke to his fiancée, who kind of laughed it off because it was such an old event, but it had grown in such magnitude in his mind. And here's where you may be noticing some movement from secrecy to openness, from shame to shared humanity. And what I mean by that is we all make mistakes. From fear to trust, from splitting to integration. Remember, the true and the false self. And from concrete thinking, I am bad, disgusting, immoral, to more symbolized thinking. Things that are thinkable and speakable are less traumatic. And all of this suggests growth in the capacity for intimacy and, more importantly, self-acceptance. All of this talk about secrets and deception brings me to something that's actually been coming into the consulting room lately. Several patients have referenced the Netflix series, The Beast in Me. Perhaps you heard of it or you saw it yourself. But there's particularly one of the final scenes, this is what keeps getting referenced, not because of the crime that took place in this series, but because of what it captures psychologically. And this is one of the main points of these videos that I've been making on secrecy. What it's like to sit alone with a false, hidden self, and what happens when the secret can no longer be contained within. Remember, that's because it's toxic, and there's pressure and a need to get it out. If you want to hear an analysis of the split off double life that's created when there's a life of secrecy, check out my podcast. I go into it there. There's a lot more to say about secrets, but the main point is that secrets don't stay quiet. They work on you from the inside. They distort relationships, fuel paranoia, and embolden the internal persecutor, what I've been mentioning, that critical voice, until something has to give. What I hoped I demonstrated in these videos is, in contrast, when something shameful is spoken, first in the consulting room and sometimes later in a relationship, it has the possibility of becoming thinkable, shareable, and therefore less traumatic. But of course, this closure is not risk-free. It can elicit hurt, anger, or rejection. And that very risk is part of the psychic tension secrecy was meant to contain. But this is all about living in the real world. There are certain dangers that come along with living in reality as compared to the false self, the false world, the false narrative. Again, remember I gave that example of the man who runs off with the prostitutes. Anyway, please feel free to check out my podcast, Narcissism Decoder, if you want to do a deeper dive into lying and secrecy. I just posted 2 full episodes there. There's still so much more to explore about this topic and related dynamics. If you're finding this discussion helpful and you want to learn more about the various facets of narcissism and related personality organizations, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next video clip. If you want to do an even deeper dive, check out my podcast. I go into far more detail there. Okay, until next time, take care of yourself. Bye for now.